The cabin stood like a sentinel at the edge of the forest, weathered by years, but still proud. Its walls were built from rough timber that James Walker had hauled and cut himself. Moss grew along the stones of the chimney, and the front porch creaked with every step, a sound that had become a kind of music to him. James sat there most mornings, steaming mug of black coffee in his hands, watching the mist lift off the creek that wound behind his land. To him, this place was more than shelter. It was peace, earned after years of service. He had been a soldier most of his life. Iraq, Afghanistan. Desert heat, dust storms, nights under skies burning with tracer fire. When he came home, his body carried scars, and his mind carried more. The world beyond the tree line was noisy, fast, and full of people who didn't understand. But here, in his cabin, surrounded by pines and silence, James could breathe again. The cabin was his sanctuary. His father had always told him, "Every man needs a place that answers only to him." For James, this cabin was exactly that. But lately, the peace had been disturbed. It started when developers carved a road into the hills nearby. They cut down trees, cleared the brush, and built a row of luxury homes that looked entirely out of place. White walls, polished decks, satellite dishes glaring against the sky. The families who moved in formed a homeowners association, a body that promised order, safety, and value. To James, it sounded like control. At first, he ignored them. Their meetings, their newsletters, their rules about mailbox height and lawn maintenance. None of it had anything to do with him. His cabin had stood for nearly 5 decades, long before they'd ever heard of Pine Valley. He figured they'd leave him be. He was wrong. One summer morning, as he split logs by the side of his cabin, he heard footsteps crunching up his gravel path. Wiping sweat from his brow, James turned to see 3 people approaching. At the front was a woman in a tailored blouse, her blonde hair in a neat bob, sunglasses perched on her nose despite the shade of the pines. Behind her trailed 2 men, one with a clipboard, the other with a camera slung around his neck. "Mr. Walker?" the woman asked, her tone sharp and practiced. "That's me," James replied, setting his axe down. "What can I do for you?" "I'm Karen Miller," she said, extending a manicured hand he didn't take. "President of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. We've come to discuss your structure." James crossed his arms. "You mean my cabin?" Karen smiled thinly. "Yes. This cabin is, frankly, out of compliance with community standards. It's lowering property values for the rest of us. We've determined it needs to be removed." The man with the clipboard scribbled something. The one with the camera raised it and snapped a photo of James's porch without asking. James's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, this cabin isn't part of your community. It's mine. Been mine since 1975. I built it. I live here. And nobody's tearing it down." Karen's smile widened, but her eyes were cold. "That's not how this works. The HOA has jurisdiction over this area. If you won't comply, we'll be forced to take legal action." James stepped closer, towering over her. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a man who had stared down worse. "Lady, I've been threatened before, by people with far more power than a neighborhood committee. This cabin is mine, and no stack of papers or votes is going to change that." Karen hesitated, then turned sharply on her heel. "We'll see," she snapped. "Expect formal notice within the week." As she marched down the path, the clipboard man jogging to keep up, James stood in the shadow of his cabin, fists clenched. The peace of the morning was gone, replaced by a storm brewing on the horizon. For the first time in years, James Walker felt like he was back in enemy territory. Only this time, the battlefield wasn't sand and stone. It was home, and he had no intention of surrendering it. The orange notice was the first real shot fired. James found it nailed to his cabin door one misty morning, the hammer marks still fresh in the wood. The paper screamed in bold red letters, "Notice of violation. Immediate action required. Structure deemed non-compliant. Mandatory removal within 30 days." Beneath the text was the HOA's seal, scrawled with Karen Miller's signature. James ripped it down, crumpling it in his fist. His jaw tightened as he looked out at the trees surrounding his cabin. Non-compliant, he muttered. Been standing longer than their houses have existed. That evening, he drove into town for supplies. At the hardware store, whispers followed him. A young man by the counter asked the clerk, "Is it true? HOA's going to tear down the vet's cabin?" The clerk shrugged, but James saw the doubt in their eyes. It stung, not because he needed their approval, but because the lie was already spreading. By the next week, the harassment escalated. Two men in khakis showed up, clipboards in hand, walking slow circles around his property. "Unsafe building practices," one muttered. "Improper septic system," said the other, jotting notes. James walked over, wiping sawdust from his hands. "You lost?" he asked. The taller man looked up. "We're inspectors. Responding to complaints from the HOA." James narrowed his eyes. "Complaints? My cabin's been here nearly 50 years. "What complaints?" "Dock is unapproved. Woodpile's a fire hazard. Your roof—" James cut him off. "Get off my land." The man stiffened. "Sir, we're authorized to—" "You're authorized to leave," James said, stepping closer. "Now." They didn't argue, not with the steel in his eyes. They packed up fast and drove off, dust rising from his gravel path. That night, headlights swept across his cabin windows. He peeked through the curtain and saw a car idling near his gate. A flash, someone taking pictures. By the time he opened the door, the car sped off into the dark. Within days, envelopes began to fill his mailbox. Fine, unauthorized structure. Fine, violation of community design standards. Fine, hazardous wood storage. Each one demanded hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. James stacked them on his kitchen table, shaking his head. When his old friend Tom stopped by to drop off venison, he whistled at the pile. "They're trying to drown you in paper, Jim." James grunted. "Let 'em try." But the pressure didn't stop there. Karen herself returned, this time with 2 HOA board members. They stood at the foot of his porch like generals surveying enemy territory. "Mr. Walker," Karen began, her voice dripping with false politeness, "ignoring notices won't make them go away. You're required to comply. We've already voted on this." James leaned on his porch railing, arms crossed. "Lady, you can vote on what color curtains you want in your houses for all I care. But this land?" He stamped his boot on the wood. "This is mine. Bought, paid for, and built with my own hands." Karen's lips curled into a smirk. "Not for long. Once the county sees how unsafe this cabin is, you'll have no choice but to leave. Do yourself a favor and go quietly." James chuckled darkly. "I didn't go quietly overseas, and I sure as hell won't go quietly here." Karen's eyes narrowed. She snapped her fingers, and one of the board members pinned another notice to his fence before they turned and walked away. James watched them go, his blood hot but his face calm. He'd been through firefights, ambushes, and nights when the world seemed to end. This wasn't combat, but it was still a war. And he knew one thing. He'd fight it the same way he always had, head on, without fear. As he gathered the new notice and tossed it onto the growing pile inside, he muttered, "They picked the wrong man." By autumn, the fight was no longer just about notices and fines. The HOA had escalated their war, and James Walker knew they were aiming for the kill. It started with whispers. At the diner in town, James overheard 2 men talking over coffee. "They say that old cabin isn't even legal." "Yeah, HOA claims it's on community land now. Reckon he's just squatting?" James set down his cup with a hard clink. The men glanced up, caught his stare, and looked away quick. But the damage was done. The lie had spread. A week later, James got a thick envelope in the mail. Inside were pages of legal jargon stamped with HOA letterheads. At the top, petition for property review, claim of invalid ownership. He read slowly, jaw tightening with every line. The HOA was formally challenging his deed, insisting that the land his cabin sat on had been absorbed into Pine Valley's community jurisdiction after the new development was built. They wanted the county to declare the property common ground, which meant his cabin could be bulldozed without his consent. James let out a sharp laugh. "Absorbed," he muttered. like a damn sponge. But he wasn't laughing for long. That weekend, strange trucks began showing up on the gravel road that wound toward his land. Surveyors unloaded tripods and measuring gear. Men in reflective vests paced around with notepads, marking trees with orange spray paint. James stepped off his porch, his boots crunching the leaves, and walked straight toward them. "Morning," he said evenly, though his voice carried the edge of steel. "What's your business on my property?" One of the men, young and nervous, adjusted his hard hat. Sir, we're contracted by Pine Valley HOA. Boundary confirmation. Just routine." James's eyes narrowed. Routine? He pointed at the faded wooden post, with carved initials his grandfather had set decades ago. "That's the boundary. Been the boundary since 1975. My deed says so. You boys better pack it up before I call the sheriff." The men shifted uneasily, but one older surveyor shrugged. "We're just doing our job, sir. If you've got a problem, take it up with the HOA." James stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "Son, I fought overseas so people could come home to what was theirs. You're standing on mine. Pack it up. Now." Something in his tone, calm but dangerous, convinced them. Within minutes, they were loading their equipment back into the trucks. Dust rose as they drove off, leaving James alone with the orange paint marks scarring his trees. That night, as the crickets sang and the creek bubbled softly behind his cabin, James sat at his table with a single lamp burning. He pulled out his old leather satchel and began laying out documents. The original deed, county maps, tax receipts, even faded photographs of him as a young man building the cabin's frame. He traced his finger over the signatures, the seals, the stamps. His grandfather had saved everything, preparing for a day just like this. Still, the pressure weighed heavy. Every trip into town brought stares. Some folks whispered support. Others looked away, afraid of crossing the HOA. Even his mailbox felt like enemy territory, each day stuffed with more fines, threats, and letters designed to grind him down. Tom, his old army buddy, stopped by one evening with a six-pack. They sat on the porch in silence for a while before Tom finally spoke. "They're trying to bury you in paperwork, Jim. They figure you'll get tired, sell out, and walk away." James took a slow sip, his eyes fixed on the tree line. "They don't know me very well, then." "You gonna fight 'em?" James's lips pressed into a thin line. "Damn right I am. Not just for me. For everyone who thinks they can be pushed off their own land." The night was still after that, but in James's chest, a fire burned steady. The HOA thought they were tightening the noose. But James Walker wasn't the kind of man who went quietly. He was a soldier, and this was just another battlefield. The courthouse in Pine Valley hadn't seen this much commotion in years. By the time the hearing was scheduled, word had spread across town. The HOA was trying to seize a veteran's cabin. Farmers, townsfolk, even a few local reporters packed into the benches, their whispers filling the air like restless wind. James Walker walked in quietly, his boots echoing against the polished floor. He wore a simple dark suit, the same one he had worn to his daughter's wedding years ago. In his hand, he carried a worn leather satchel, heavy with papers, maps, and proof of every dollar and every nail he had put into his land. His face was calm, his shoulders square. Across the aisle, Karen Miller swept in like she owned the place. Her navy dress was sharp, her hair freshly styled, and her heels clicked like a metronome of arrogance. Behind her sat two board members and a high-priced attorney in a tailored suit, his briefcase gleaming like a weapon. Karen's smirk widened when she spotted James. She leaned over to the attorney and whispered, loud enough for the gallery to hear, "Let's wrap this up quickly. He won't know what hit him." The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a gravelly voice, entered the chamber. "Court is in session," he barked, and silence fell. Karen's attorney was the first to rise. He spoke with polished confidence, gesturing toward James as if he were a trespasser, rather than a man defending his home. "Your Honor, the facts are clear," the lawyer began. "Mr. Walker occupies a structure that is not only out of compliance with Pine Valley standards, but also sits on land that rightfully falls under HOA jurisdiction. This so-called cabin is a hazard, an eyesore, and a violation of community bylaws. We demand its immediate removal." Karen sat back with a triumphant smile, tapping her pen against her clipboard, like a drumbeat of victory. The board members beside her nodded solemnly, as though the case was already won. When it was James's turn, he rose slowly. The courtroom went quiet. He set the leather satchel on the table and opened it, pulling out a thick stack of papers. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of someone who had learned long ago never to flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor," James said, "that's a fine story they've spun. But here are the facts." He handed the judge a yellow document with neat cursive writing across the top. "This is the original deed to my land, dated 1975, purchased with money I saved after coming home from the Army. Signed, notarized, and filed with this very county." He placed another paper on top. "These are tax receipts, paid every year for nearly 50 years. Every dollar documented." The lawyer shifted in his seat, frowning. Karen's pen froze mid-tap. James pulled out a survey map, its edges frayed from years of folding. "And here is the county survey, proving my boundaries. That cabin isn't illegal. It isn't an eyesore. It's mine. Built with my own two hands." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. A few heads nodded. One man whispered, "He's got them dead to rights." Karen's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Objection! This doesn't negate the HOA's authority." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. He leaned over the documents, adjusting his glasses, his brow furrowing deeper with each line he read. James, still standing tall, glanced toward Karen. Her smirk was gone. Then, he reached into the satchel once more and held up a faded black and white photograph. It showed a younger James, shirtless and smiling, hammer in hand, standing before the half-built cabin with his father beside him. "This cabin isn't just wood and nails," James said, his voice thick but firm. "It's my legacy. My family's blood and sweat are in these walls. And no HOA, no bylaw, no committee vote will erase that." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge's expression softened for a moment before he masked it with stern professionalism. Karen slammed her hand on the table, her face red. "He's bluffing. That deed can't still be valid." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Mrs. Miller, one more outburst, and you'll be held in contempt." Silence fell again. The balance of the room had shifted. James sat back down, calm as ever, his documents spread neatly across the table. For the first time, it wasn't him on trial. It was the HOA, and everyone in the room could feel it. The air in the courtroom was thick, charged with tension. James's documents sat neatly stacked before the judge, but the HOA attorney wasn't ready to concede. He shuffled his papers, his polished confidence beginning to crack. "Your Honor," he said, forcing steadiness into his tone, "the defense has provided documents, yes. But these are outdated. The county has changed. Boundaries have shifted. This land is part of a modern community now, and community governance must take precedence." Karen leaned forward, her eyes flashing triumph again, nodding as if her lawyer had just delivered the knockout blow. But Judge Matheson, gruff, sharp-eyed, a man who had lived in Pine Valley long before the HOA ever existed, wasn't impressed. He tapped his gavel lightly, then turned to Alicia Price, James's attorney. "Counselor," he said, "do you have any additional evidence to corroborate your client's claims?" Alicia's lips curved into a small, confident smile. "As a matter of fact, Your Honor, we do." She turned toward the back of the courtroom. "We call Mr. Charles Whitaker to the stand." A murmur swept the room as an older man rose, walking slowly but steadily down the aisle. Whitaker was the county's most senior surveyor, a man whose reputation was built on accuracy and honesty. He carried a large folder tucked under his arm, marked with the county seal. Karen's smirk faltered. Whitaker was sworn in, and Alicia wasted no time. "Mr. Whitaker, can you tell the court what you've brought with you today?" Whitaker adjusted his spectacles and laid the folder on the bench. "This," he said in a gravelly voice, "is the most recent county survey of Pine Valley, dated just last year. It confirms property lines based on historical deeds and updated measurements. And according to the survey, Mr. Walker's cabin and surrounding land fall completely within his privately owned property." He flipped open a large map, spreading it across the judge's desk. Thick black lines traced the boundaries of the development. And there, in bold, was a clear outline of James's property. Self-contained, untouched, indisputable. But Whitaker wasn't finished. He tapped the map again, his pen pointing to several shaded areas along the lake and creek. Furthermore, he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, it appears the HOA has encroached onto Mr. Walker's land. Several of their fences, landscaping extensions, and even part of a community walkway fall inside his property line. In plain language, the HOA has been trespassing. The courtroom exploded with gasps. Reporters scribbled furiously. Neighbors whispered loudly enough that the bailiff had to call for quiet. One older woman in the back muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Karen shot to her feet. "That's a lie. This is ridiculous. Those surveys must be wrong." The judge slammed his gavel. Crack. "Sit down, Mrs. Miller, or I'll have you escorted out." Karen froze, trembling with rage, but sat down hard, her cheeks burning crimson. Alicia stepped closer to the witness stand. "So, to be clear, Mr. Whitaker?" Whitaker nodded firmly. "Mr. Walker owns his land outright. The cabin is legal. The taxes have been paid. And the HOA not only has no authority here, they've been actively overstepping for years." Silence hung for a moment, heavy as stone. Then, the judge leaned back, folding his hands. His expression was unreadable, but everyone in the room could feel it. The tide had turned. James sat steady, his hands folded in front of him, eyes forward. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat. But inside, a fire of vindication warmed him. For months, they had called him a trespasser, a squatter, a man clinging to something he didn't own. And now here was the truth, laid bare before everyone. Across the aisle, Karen gripped her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her power was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. The HOA thought they had trapped James Walker, but instead, they had trapped themselves, and the whole town was watching it happen. The courtroom was so still that even the ticking of the old clock on the back wall felt deafening. Judge Matheson sat hunched over the documents, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he read line after line. The original deed, the tax receipts, the surveyor's maps, and the photographs stretching back nearly 50 years. Karen shifted in her seat, her pen tapping nervously against her clipboard. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering frantically, but the way his voice cracked betrayed the truth. He already knew the battle was lost. Finally, the judge set the papers down, removed his glasses, and looked over the rim of the bench. His voice was steady, resonant, the kind that carried authority forged over decades. "This court has reviewed the evidence thoroughly. The deed is valid. The taxes are paid. The surveys confirm that Mr. Walker's cabin and surrounding land are entirely his private property. The HOA has no jurisdiction here. None." The words landed like a hammer. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, rising quickly into whispers of disbelief, then nods of approval. But Judge Matheson wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Furthermore, this court finds the HOA has engaged in repeated harassment, unlawful interference, and deliberate misinformation against Mr. Walker. Their attempts to seize his land were not only baseless, but reckless." Karen shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "This isn't fair. We voted. Our bylaws say, crack." The gavel slammed down, echoing like a gunshot. "Mrs. Miller, sit down," the judge barked. "Your HOA's bylaws hold no power over land you do not own. Continue this behavior, and I'll hold you in contempt." Karen froze, her face flushed crimson, and slowly sank back into her chair. For the first time, she looked small. The judge straightened the papers before him. "The ruling is as follows. Mr. Walker retains full and unquestioned ownership of his cabin and land. The HOA is ordered to cease all interference, pay damages to Mr. Walker, and cover all his legal costs. Case closed." The gavel came down hard one last time. The gallery erupted. Some clapped openly, others cheered, and a few even whistled before the bailiff restored order. Neighbors who had doubted James exchanged wide-eyed looks. A young man in the back muttered, "Damn, he did it." James didn't move right away. He sat tall, steady, his hands folded in front of him, letting the words settle. Then, slowly, he stood. Alicia, his lawyer, gave him a small smile and whispered, "We won." He gave her a respectful nod but said nothing. There was no need. His silence spoke louder than any boast. Across the aisle, Karen gripped her clipboard so tightly the plastic cracked. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. The board members beside her looked anywhere but at James. Their empire had crumbled, and everyone had seen it. James walked calmly toward the courthouse doors. As he passed, a few townsfolk reached out, patting his shoulder, murmuring, "Good job, Jim," or "Proud of you, Walker." He simply nodded, his eyes forward. Outside, the sun was bright, the sky clear. For the first time in months, James felt like the weight pressing on his chest had lifted. His cabin, his sanctuary, was safe. He had defended it, not with fists or rifles, but with truth, patience, and the strength of a man who had already survived worse than any HOA could throw at him. The HOA thought they could erase him. Instead, they had erased themselves. And Pine Valley would never forget the day James Walker proved it. The woods were quiet again. Weeks had passed since the verdict, and the courthouse whispers had faded into stories traded at the diner, the gas station, and even the church pews on Sundays. Everyone knew what had happened. The HOA had tried to take down James Walker's cabin, and they had failed, loudly, publicly, and permanently. For James, life returned to the rhythm he loved. Mornings with black coffee steaming in his mug as he sat on the porch. Afternoons spent splitting firewood, fishing by the creek, or patching the old shingles on the roof. Evenings by the fire, the logs crackling and the quiet wrapping around him like an old blanket. But something had changed. His cabin wasn't just his anymore. It had become a symbol. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid him now came by with handshakes, pies, or just a quiet, "Glad you stood your ground, Jim." A young couple with 2 kids stopped one Sunday afternoon. "Mr. Walker," the father said, shifting nervously, "we're new here. HOA gave us trouble for putting up a swing set. Just wanted to say, thank you for what you did. You made it easier for the rest of us." James listened, nodding slowly. "You don't let folks push you off what's yours," he said simply. That's the lesson. Word of his victory even traveled beyond Pine Valley. Veterans from other counties reached out, some by letter, some in person, shaking his hand and calling him brother. One old Marine told him, "You didn't just win for yourself, Walker. You won for all of us, who came home looking for peace." One crisp autumn evening, James sat on his porch as the sun set behind the pines. The light caught the cabin walls, painting them gold, making the place glow like it was alive. He sipped his coffee and looked out at the land, his land. The grass, the creek, the trees, the old fence posts his father had hammered in decades ago. Every piece of it was soaked in memory. Tom, his old army buddy, pulled up in his pickup, bringing a couple of beers. They sat together in silence for a long time, listening to the forest settle in for the night. Finally, Tom chuckled. "Hell of a thing, Jim. They thought they could scare you out." James gave a faint smile. "They thought wrong." Tom nodded, then raised his bottle in a quiet toast. James clinked his against it, the sound small but sharp in the cool evening air. When Tom left and the stars began to show, James stayed on the porch, alone with the night. The crickets sang, the creek gurgled softly, and an owl hooted in the distance. He breathed in deep, the kind of breath that fills the chest and empties the soul of its weight. For the first time in months, he felt truly at peace. The HOA had tried to erase him, but all they had done was carve his name deeper into the soil of Pine Valley. James Walker was still standing, and as long as his cabin stood, his legacy would stand with it.